Buenas tardes.
Good afternoon.
Bueno, el panel será en español. Les pedimos disculpas
The meeting
por la
will be in
extensión y la
Spanish.
complejidad
We
de los
apologize
asuntos que
because
pretendemos
we will be
tratar
talking
para
for some
hacerlo con
time
mayor libertad.
and we will be
Hemos
discussing
decidido hacerlo en
complex
español.
issues in order to
Eh,
do so more freely. We've
Somos
decided to do it in
nacionales
Spanish.
mexicanos. Yo creo que
I will
cada
first
cual
in,
puede hacer
we can introduce
es un
ourselves.
ejercicio de libertad.
It's
Y
an
sobre todo
exercise
porque
in
esta población viene de
freedom,
un contexto de Estado totalitario,
especially becomes when you come from a
se toma
totalitarian
por mayor
state,
a las
you
víctimas de
really
Cuba
come
y de
to
Cuba.
enjoy
Entonces, Ulises,
enjoy
Marta,
this.
siéntanse libres. Yo me
So
llamo Leo
Ulises
Fernández
and
Otaño,
Marta, feel free.
soy
My name is Leo
historiador,
Fernandez
soy
Otaño. I am a
católico,
historian. I
y
am
nada,
a
estamos
Catholic
aquí
layperson,
para hacer varias lecturas de la realidad
and we are
cubana y de los
here
retos del
to
activismo en
interpret
Cuba.
Cuban reality and
Por
the
aquí tenemos a
challenges
Marta,
of
que primero que
activism
nada es
in
la mamá de Marta.
Cuba. This is Marta, who first and foremost is Nina's mom. I try to be more than that, but it's hard because after the quarantine and the pandemic, it's been hard, but I would like to be more than her mom so that she also will be more than someone's mom. I am Marta Ramirez. I am an independent feminist and journalist. 3 years ago, Nina made me her mother, and I will be very excited. I might sound angry at times. I apologize. It's not because of you, it's because of the context from which I
Buenas
come.
tardes, mi nombre es
Thank you.
Ulises Padrón Suarez, soy
Good
activista
afternoon. My name is Ulises Padrón
afrodescendiente.
Suarez. I
Llevo
am an
casi
LGBTQ Afro
casi una
activist.
década haciendo activismo en Cuba y
I have
además
been doing
de
activism for
colaborar
about a
bastante
decade in
con
Cuba, and I also
revistas
collaborate with
feministas y
independent media.
anarcosindicalistas.
I write articles for independent
Bueno, repetirle la
media.
bienvenida y
So again, I will
recordar el
welcome
título del
you,
panel, ¿no?
and
Para ir entrando en calor. Últimos
the title
acontecimientos en
of the
Cuba, sociedad
panel
civil y
is
prácticas
Latest
cívicas.
Events in Cuba, Civic
Bueno,
Society and
Cubana,
Civic
como hemos
Practices.
visto,
Cuban
recientemente se ha
society,
visto
as we have seen,
en un proceso, un ciclo
has lately been
cívico.
immersed
Yo
in
me
a
gusta
civic
denominarlo
process or
como la
cycle.
marcha LGTB
I
del
like
15
to
de
call it
noviembre, porque ahora
it's
mismo lo que
somewhere
vivimos
between
es
an
como si fuese la
LGBTQ
experiencia
march and
de una
November
sociedad civil.
15th.
En una
Right
sociedad, en
now,
un
civil
contexto
society is
totalitario,
folding back.
donde en el 2018 comienza
It's
el
Cuba
uso
is a
masivo
totalitarian
de la
society,
telefonía,
and in
de los
2018,
datos móviles en la telefonía
people
celular.
began to
Y esto implica
use
algo muy
their
importante
cell
en
phones to
la
access the
ciudadanía
internet
y la
widely,
disidencia
and
cívica.
this has
Implica
introduced a
que
shift
la
in
sociedad y
terms
sobre
of
todo las generaciones
citizenship
más
and civil
jóvenes
resistance.
pudieron acceder a
It
un
means
medio de
that
expresión
society and
y de
especially young people
socialización
have
de las
gained
ideas
access to a
de la
means for
crítica y el
expressing and
debate entre los
socializing
diferentes en Cuba. O
ideas
sea, si
and
bien
criticizing the
tenemos esa
government.
labor
And
pionera,
this is
encomiable
something
de los
completely
medios
new in
independientes,
Cuba. Of course,
también
independent
el
media
vacío de
are
la
an
conectividad de la
important
ciudadanía, esto llega en el
precedent,
2018 a Cuba. Y
but
esto
it's
llega como
only
que al borde
since
en los albores
2018 that
de
we have
una
a new
reforma
level of
de la Constitución
connectivity in
que
Cuba.
también introdujo algo muy importante.
And this
Hizo algo muy
also
importante
coincides
para
with a reform to the
plantear al espacio
Constitution
público sus
that
reclamos.
introduced something new
Muchos
because it allowed
planteaban en sus
citizens to
acuerdos
formulate their
que el
demands
objetivo
in
común
public
es una
space.
línea muy
And many
fina
of
en el
us have
sentido
come
de
out to
la línea de
express
estar
our
que las personas expresaran,
dissatisfaction.
dijeran en qué no
And
estaban de acuerdo.
so
Entonces, muchas
the
veces
authoritarianism
la
of the state has
ciudadanía
created a very
se
narrow
iba por
space
encima de
that
lo que
people
estaba
have used.
establecido. Por ejemplo, en la Universidad de La Habana hubo
Sometimes
facultades
people
que para
have
defender
overstepped
el debate constitucional
these
muchos alumnos
conditions.
rehusaron
And the University
abandonar
of Havana, for example,
después
some
del
debates had to be
radicalismo, claro,
suspended
siempre
because students started
con un
to
ritmo más
question.
rápido. Se estaba criticando ya desde antes
Activists
los acuerdos
always
gubernamentales que regulaban
go
la estructura
faster, and they were
política
already criticizing the
la
new government
orientación
decrees that were regulating
política
and
independiente
censoring. independent artistic production. For this reason, in 2019, after the constitutional referendum, something new emerged, especially for the youngest people. At that time, to occupy public space became extremely important. Already in 2018, we have the San Isidro movement, which is strongly critical of the state, and others began to occupy public space. But on May 11th, 2019, when the LGBTQ plus community marched for a demonstration, this was the first time when the government visibly repressed a large protest. And this gave rise to a growing cycle of protests. And this intensified further during the pandemic. Bear in mind that in Cuba, eating a piece of chocolate was a luxury, so people were locked up in their houses, but they were going through extreme lack. And this is, as we put it, this turned up the pressure. And in November 2020, the rapper Dennis Ulises was arbitrarily arrested. A group of activists went to the headquarters of the San Isidro movement, and in the night of November 26, government forces broke into the house of the artist Luis Manuel Otero Alcántara, and they assaulted the activist and a private residence, which is legally protected. And I think that when they broke this door, the door to Luis Manuel Otero's house, we reached the climax of this civic cycle. The response was very interesting, namely November 27th, when around 500 artists, intellectuals, citizens got together outside the Ministry of Culture to demand several things. Some of them might be proper to the profession or to particulars, but I think that it was a general demand for a stop to repression. This is a generation that we have been processing the fears of our parents. When you were whispering in the kitchen, our parents did it that way, but current generations, we're doing it on the streets. These generations' urge to speak on the street went over to the Ministry of Culture. In Cuba, this was crucial because it forced authoritarianism to come up with a response. A high government official sat down on the table with 32 creators, intellectuals, to respond to their demands, and did so with television present and independent media. And in Cuba, this nothing similar had happened in the past 60 years. And this led the government to be compelled to act roughly, in a rough manner. On the one hand, it was exposing artists, intellectuals, and citizens on public television in order to coerce them and to chastise a sector of society so that people would see, look, if you participate in public life, your parents might see you on TV, on public TV, without a right to response. Then on January 27th, many of those artists returned to the Ministry of Culture, also driven by other episodes of repression between November and January, but they also had other requests and demands. Also, it had been agreed that 3 activists would have a dialogue with the Ministry of Culture, but I think something very important happened at that time, and it's something symbolic as well. The Minister of Culture hit a citizen, an independent journalist. The journalist was recording him with his cell phone because we should say this. If we in Cuba have a tool that will allow us to defend ourselves from totalitarianism, it is the cell phone because you can capture evidence. This has always happened in Cuba, but the new technologies have allowed us to make police harassment and other such things visible. And so state violence was recorded. Marta says that we live in an extremely patriarchal and conservative state, and we could now see repression. And also it was the Minister of Culture who was doing it. There was another process that was already underway of writing letters. Between November 2020 and July 11, people were writing letters expressing support. A group of artists, intellectuals, and citizens later requested the Minister of Culture to resign. After 60 years, this was an extremely daring attempt by citizens living inside the island, and some of them had official positions. I think this was important. Sometimes in Cuba, people will say, I'm not signing another letter, because it's true that during the past few years we have known how powerful it can be to sign a letter. It's a symbolic exercise because they use those letters as napkins, but it's important for the citizenship. Also, they don't actually use them as napkins. I think that some of them have yielded results. First of all, you document repression, and you document what we think about this repression or even the solutions that we are offering, because some letters convey solutions by civil society. On the other hand, some of the letters have been heard, not as we would like. Sometimes, of course, they have led to further repression to signatories. And this reflects, unfortunately, when you live in a situation of violence. I compare the Cuban state to an abusive father. It doesn't provide food, it provides no social assistance, but you have to follow the rules and obey them without protest. So you are an object of the state's violence, and this is also reflected in the fact that sometimes they return the letters, sometimes we don't achieve victories. What we do is expose ourselves further, and unfortunately we have to learn how to make these reversals into victories as long as our bodies can handle the abuse and violence. That's right. For example, a group of feminist activists delivered a letter to the Cuban parliament, and there was a reply. It's true that other initiatives have not received a reply. I myself was expelled from a PhD program in Havana University a few months ago, and a group of friends wrote a letter to support me, and I confess I wrote to the Minister of Higher Education and the Dean of the university, but what gave me peace was feeling the support of my peers in a public document. I knew that the battle was lost from the start, but it's very important because it has two dimensions. It's an articulation on the one hand. You articulate support, but you also put state totalitarianism into view. Then, on July 11th, something happened before on April 30th. On Obispo Street, a group of activists who were sort of bearers of popular wisdom. I think that this was distinctive about this group. They embody a citizenship that is exhausted and is protesting, and they did it to manifest solidarity with Luis Manuel Otero Alcántara, and they were repressed. In fact, they were imprisoned for 9 months. One of them was banished. Yeah, one of them was banished, which is one of the measures that the Cuban government is using again as a patriarchal form of government. We didn't know the practice of banishment since the times of the Spanish colony. And then on July 11th, there was a popular outburst, an uprising. It's been painful. The families, for example, of July 11th have been forced to hear officials on public television calling their children vandals. They are accused of orchestrating a vandalic coup d'état. Citizens who are tired, exhausted after standing in line, lack of medication, watching their friends and neighbors die during the pandemic, exhausted by electricity cuts, lack of food. And on July 11, citizens go out and take over public space. And it was a popular outburst, and I should say as a historian that since the early 1960s, at the early stages of the revolutionary process, this had never happened. Over 60 cities, and it's a popular outburst from the very start. Its point of origin is poor neighborhoods in all of these cities and slowly approach the city downtowns. For example, La Winera, I have worked there with families whose children are in prison. There was a spot that was called the dump yard, and they walked towards the police station. Why? Because for them, the police represents power. They marched peacefully up to the police station, and that's when they confronted state violence. It went in the opposite direction because then they went to their houses. They beat up many women. They broke into many residential spaces. And today, in that community, there are over 60 citizens in prison. This is a poor community. Two things happened after July 11th, a new wave of repression that it's still ongoing, but also a desire for civic struggle that became visible in the archipelago platform, which has its problems, and a march on November 15th. It was an attempted march, and although it did not reach its intended aim, it led the citizenship to engage in reflection around the right to protest. The members of the Archipelago platform, we tried to exhaust all legal paths to prevent violence and to have legal backing, because the letter of the 2019 Constitution says so. We knew that we were exposed to interrogations, harassment to our families, but we tried to do it legally. We even protested in front of the tribunals, demanding during the last week for our right to protest. At the end, the march did not take place as we expected it to. For instance, in my neighborhood, I asked the neighbors, did people go out? I couldn't go out because there were two police cars parked right in front of my house, but one of my neighbors told me it was a silent protest. Some citizens went outside and they were detained, are still in prison, as like Professor Pedro Albert, but it was a silent protest that forced the state to bring their military apparatus out to public space and undertake a wave of interrogations and coercion that without precedent. After this brief introduction, it's been a very agitated cycle, and right now perhaps we seem to be folding back, but it's hard to understand exactly what is taking place. There are over 1,000 political prisoners right now in Cuba. Cuba has an extremely high rate of political prisoners. Not even Nicaragua and Venezuela together have the same number. And yet, although the citizenship is folding back, I mean, you have something that seems so simple, electricity cuts. When you have an electricity cut that is 12 hours long, citizens are getting together to organize a conga. They are banging on their pans. There is, for example, the case of Amalia Calzadilla, who garnered a lot of support on social media. I don't want to talk too long, so I want to ask Marta. She's both a feminist activist and an independent journalist. I think that these are two dimensions of her life. Marta, how is independent journalism functioning in Cuba after the internet became widespread? And what nuances and lacks do independent journalists experience in Cuba's authoritarian context? I apologize for jumping in earlier. Also, we have a space called El Desvelo. Marta and I are close friends. We have a space called El Desvelo in Telegram, and Marta is often my guest, and so we jump into each other's conversations often. So sorry for jumping in. Before I answered Leo's questions, I wanted to express solidarity with my colleague Juan Enrique Rodriguez, who was prevented from traveling to Kassel due to an arbitrary decision on the part of Germany's migration authorities. He should have been here with us today. Jorge is also a colleague is not only a colleague journalist, he was also alongside us and the INSTAR team during all of the work that led up to our participation in Documenta. We have created a space that is broadcast all Fridays where we talk specifically about literature with independent writers in Cuba. So I am angry about this. And I wanted to say that I am angry at the German authorities for preventing some of our colleagues and Rafael Almanza to prevent them from traveling. There are other colleagues we don't know. Does David have a visa? Okay. So far, Jorge Enrique Rodríguez and Rafael Almanza, another great Cuban intellectual, they have been prevented from participating in this event under the argument that they are likely not to return to Cuba, as if that was not a human right. Sorry, I got carried away and angry. Well, I am older. I started doing independent journalism in 2005 when when independent journalism was incipient. There was a group of people who were already organizing independent media, and they had a very particular agenda. It was clearly focused on issues that would unmask the image of the Cuban regime. It was a militant journalism, it was a bit more activist, and at some point I tried to create bridges with them because I wanted to focus on what we call gender journalism. I wanted to talk about women and LGBTQ people and populations marginalized by the machista power, all of this transversalized, bearing in mind the color of the skin and your geographical location and things like that. And they weren't interested in this at the time. It wasn't as clear to them as it was to me back then. But there were already some publications and they were extremely criminalized. Back then, these publications they would be they would be sent abroad, basically. Uh, those that had a kind of some kind of legal footing, although they were illegal in Cuba, many activists and journalists were also imprisoned in 2003. It's called the Black Spring. I don't like to call it black because it's assuming that the color black represents something bad. My microphone keeps feeding back and I don't know what to do. So in 2005, also I wasn't, I didn't quite know exactly what kind of journalism I wanted to do, but those who were engaged in it were imprisoned, harassed, atomized. Later on, there was something close to an amnesty, but at that time, I decided to proceed independently. I finished paying my social service to the state in an official newspaper, where they also allowed me to write about music. And then I decided that I would continue my life writing about what I wanted to write about. I started collaborating with people that I already had some contact with before. For example, SEMLAC and IPS, these were agencies that focus rather on the southern part, on the southern region. But at the time, there wasn't a lot of independent journalism or platforms for publishing in Cuba. My experience changed radically in 2007 when Facebook came into the picture. I remember a friend of mine, I'm really lazy when it comes to answering messages, and phone calls were too expensive, and all of my friends were in exile. So a friend told me, you are going to get an email with a request. There will be a request. You just need to enter this password and then you change it. And I said, what is this? She said, please, you can join and then we can communicate. And indeed, I logged in out of curiosity and I started to notice that a group of people within Cuba was following me. Hold on. How do they do it? Well, they were doing exactly the same as me. They would go to a place where you could have some access to internet connection, the work center, for example. You worked your way around the system. And this is when I decided to study how people were doing journalism in Cuba, because some people were doing it. Gabriel Garcia Marquez Foundation Nuevo Periodismo was thinking about it, so I took some classes about it, and I met two teachers who are now my friends, Fernanda Carvales and Esther Vargas. Later, I was able to bring one of them to Havana to do workshops with activists about using the internet for journalism. We had very limited media and very few people were connecting to read. So maybe we were being read in Hong Kong, Germany, Argentina, but in Cuba it was a bit harder. This all changed with Facebook. I can assure you of that. I would run into people on the street who I didn't know who would tell me, I read you, don't follow me. And I would tell them, don't follow me, I don't know where I'm going. So it was a different experience now that created greater democracy to some degree, and I think that this also contributes to the emergence of a network of colleagues. We started to get together. Those of us who could not get together in physical space, because to be a journalist, you need to produce. It's almost like going to a factory. You have to be on the street, and there are no places to meet in Havana. There are bars which are designed for international tourists, and we can't afford going there. So maybe journalists can meet elsewhere in a dive, for example, and have some drinks and create a community. But we also were able to create such communities in social medias, even in a space as conservative as Facebook. It allowed us, people who were not as conservative as them, we were able to create a community and to begin to assemble what you see now, which is a wide variety of independent media. I did a survey for a colleague from the Fundación Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and I counted 35 independent media sources in Cuba. Some provide news, some are more serious, others are more analytical, but there are 35 independent media, and I think that's a good number. There is an alliance of such media for the first time. Not all of them are part of it, but directors of different media have forged an alliance, and I think that this is also an important step. As Leo was saying, during the 2 years, well, even before the Cuban government had been creating legislation to protect itself and silence the voices of civil society. This is the only thing that they would want to protect themselves against. During the past 2 years, this has intensified, but these 2 years have also been a reflection of something that is important, namely the consolidation of these media and the possibility of bringing in other agendas. For example, there is Me Too, for example. Right now, we there is a process against a Cuban musician, a singer-songwriter, accused who is formally accused by 7 women of harassing them. They are his survivors, and there is a formal accusation, and at least 30 people have also denounced him in the independent media. So it has also allowed us to bring into the agenda state issues that the state has no interest in. They don't want to talk about this. As I said, the state is an abusive father. And according to them, if we discuss these issues, we are handing over power to Yankee imperialism. And we say, well, the gringos are there and they will always be there. So we want to talk about feminicide. We want to talk about gender violence. We have many issues that we are forbidden from discussing: upbringing, childhood, the elderly. We need to discuss care and women as caregivers, the state as the guarantor of things that it no longer guarantees. So I think that I have more or less responded. Answer to your first question. What is
Sí,
your second question?
la
I
segunda
forgot,
pregunta.
sorry.
¿Qué complejidades, matices o carencias
What
se viven en el
complexities,
ejercicio
nuances,
periodismo
or
independiente
lacks are
en tiempos de
experienced in the
autoritarismo?
exercise of independent journalism in the context of Cuban authoritarianism? Well, the first thing is that you have the state against you and it criminalizes your job. Imagine if you were putting together a machine and all of a sudden the state would say that what you do is wrong and persecute you. So there is something there that breaks. I always say this, even sometimes there are issues with our colleagues, and I say, where are our readers? Where are the people who see us? We don't we're not driven by ego and we're not driven by money. I mean, Cuban independent journalism does not pay well, much unlike what state agents would like people to believe. So, criminalization, for example, targets where you get funding from. It is all illegal. Just to give you an idea, if you use crowdfunding, where all of the patrons are visible, and you are also supposed to publicly thank those who support you, a crowdfunding campaign can be criminalized.
Martí, pero además con el nuevo Código Penal hasta la
And
sonrisa
the
está
new
criminalizada.
penal code allows you to criminalize even a smile. For example, our internet is the most expensive in the world, and cell phone service as well. You can Many of us don't have enough money to pay it. I do independent journalism. I do some social communication campaign for some products, although I'm not a salesperson, and I am also a volunteer. I accompany women who are suffering from domestic violence. How do I get money? Well, there are some people who simply pay for my uh, pay for my cell phone data service, for example, without without doing it publicly. In Cuba, there is a monopoly on communications. There's only one company that provides internet service through cell phones, but twice a month you can add $25 and you get twice the amount of time to have access to the internet. The company is a state monopoly, and it also punishes us. I mean, it's part of this patriarchal apparatus. They can suspend our internet use for several days and things like that. But well, this is the thing. You can have, maybe you know my cell phone number, you appreciate what I do, you want me to continue doing my work as a volunteer, then you can help me out by giving me by paying for my cell phone service. And some journals, they dare reveal where they get economic support from, but basically they are in exile. For example, El Estornudo publicly explained where they get their funds from, but they can do this because they are abroad. So again, as I say, the Cuban state is an abusive father, and sometimes they look the other way. Sometimes they let you get away with it, and then other times they don't, and you never know. So you're always, it's like walking next to a sharp edge. You're not quite sure what's going to happen. A few months ago, for example, before I've lost track of time, I'm sorry. Some young college students invited me to a talk about obstetric violence. I mean, I asked, is it in an open space? Because I have to bring Nina with me, so can she be, can she be safe? Around 11 at night, maybe earlier, at 10, one of the girls wrote me. She's in panic. She's saying they cannot, or the talk is suspended. Agents from the state security came to say that I could not be part of that talk. Well, why? What's wrong? I said, well, if you want to go on, I will come. So we're talking, and there is a knock on my door. Two state agents, two men, one woman, and they are there to tell me that I cannot go to a talk about obstetric violence by invitation of university students. So I was with Nina. We have already been interrogated by state security twice, me and Nina. But it becomes gradually more absurd and rough. I mean, why would a talk about obstetric violence work against them? What did they think could happen there, or what did they think I was going to talk about? I have no idea. So it's this way of controlling the most minute thing, regardless of whether it does the country good or bad. They don't care. In that interrogation, which happened through the fence because I did not let them in, at that time it would have to have been the President of the Republic with a warrant. I said to them, look, this is important. They said, we know feminism is important. Of course, my friends. Well, not my friends, also my colleagues, people who know me because I'm older. They told them that I was a criminal. The same, there are other examples. I don't want to talk about individuals. The stories, some of them are told. Several of our colleagues are being harassed by state security. The only trans journalist working in Cuba today, also Lisbeth Moya, a young activist, feminist, an independent journalist who is also a communist. This is one of the incredible paradoxes that we have in this system. This is a young girl whose motto is socialism, yes, repression, no. So they are also not allowing this within our spaces. Dissent from people who do want a socialist system, but who do not want repression, they also need to express themselves. I think that the first freedom that is coerced is the freedom of our bodies when we are told you're a boy, you're a girl at birth. But, the rest comes later. I see this with Nina. Don't say, don't do, don't touch, don't express yourself, don't cry, don't laugh. So they start to coerce you, and then at the end you're almost mutilated, and they send you out to the world that way. Some systems do it more than others. I think that independently of how strong are the institutions that can work against the state. In Cuba, we're taking the first steps. The system was very skillful at erasing this from view, and it has led us to leave everything up to the state. It's a visceral paternalism. You see, and it's so clumsy, but it worked. So it's all up to the state. If they don't do it, it's their fault. And if we can't do it ourselves, then maybe next year we'll give it a try. I think that the journalism is now here to bring this into view.
Tu mejor interrogatorio.
What do you expect will happen when you return to Cuba? Oh, we will get a good interrogation. Maybe, as I said, the system is not even. The system doesn't apply to everyone in the same way. How they do it, I don't know. They have a machinery, they have a structure, repressive apparatuses. Yes, this is being broadcast through the internet. Can you repeat the question, please, so it's heard on the microphone? The question was, what awaits you when you go back to Cuba, and whether there are also spies from the state here watching you. I don't know. In totalitarian societies, you always suspect. Leo has told me for the first time in a long time I can walk around and I feel relaxed, and I said, I can't do it. I'm looking over my shoulder constantly. We have received 2 death threats. I don't know where from. And INSTAR, the Hannah Arendt Institute of Artivism, is it a group of artists? I'll explain. Tania Bruguera, she's around. A few years ago, maybe around 2015, she came to Havana when Obama and Raúl Castro announced that there was going to be a so-called thaw. Tania came and she raised a question that we were all asking. Where are we going? What has happened? For an entire year, they have been negotiating. Nobody has told us anything. And now they say, oh, well, we're going to resume relations. Well, what do we do? Where are we going? So Tania came and she had a proposal to do another version of Tatlin's Whisper, a work that she had already presented in Havana during a biennial. And then there were many terrible events with state security and the prince. They took her passport, and many other things have happened. So Tania decided, and it's one way of answering the question, she decided that strengthening civil society, people, the citizenship, that this would allow us in one way or another to survive the moment when they share out the cake, because this is going to happen with or without economic sanctions. They are distributing the cake among the mighty, and the majorities, the poor, will get none of it. So this is when she did her performance piece at her house in Tejadillo 214. The performance was an entire reading of Hannah Arendt's Origins of Totalitarianism, which I think it's a book that all Cubans should read when they are young, alongside Microphysics of Power and other works that would allow us to understand what is happening. And when they did this performance, this was the beginning of what we now call INSTAR. It's a group of artists, but there are also intellectuals and people who work in social communication, and anyone who wishes to join. And it's more or less what you are seeing here. I call it an umbrella institution. It's a place where you can find tools, the tools that you can share, the tools that we have, the tools that Tanya is able to find, and we as well. And we organize workshops and other kinds of events intended to strengthen civil society. And of course, it is traversed by art, because it's basically artists who are doing it. And this is what you see at Documenta. I think that it is a very fair curatorial account of INSTAR's work in Havana. Another question. Maybe we can ask the questions at the end. I want to talk to Ulises now, so we have a global view. I think that it might even be better. I really like to use the word the path or the road, camino, because in Cuba we continue walking in spite of difficulties, and along the path you have to reinvent yourself. Nowadays we have a new family code, and we have found in response an activism that is based in walking. Ulises, tell us about LGBTQ plus activism starting in May 11. Well, I think that we might have to go a bit further back in time. When we talk about May 11, it seems as though that was the birth of LGBTQ plus activism had started there. But actually, these forms of activism had been working for quite some time before. First, first we would have to discuss earlier projects. For instance, there was a project. Many initiatives coming from civil society have created a layer of civil society that is interested in LGBTQ issues and anti-racism. There is, for example, a project called Arcoiris, the HCH groups, and other initiatives that have worked to deal with the issue of HIV, uh, especially discussing sexual health and reproductive rights. And all of this has created a critical awareness in Cuban society and nurtured efforts to demand the state, which, as Marta says, it's a patriarchal state. So, with little room for dissident voices. And if you are a dissident, you are harassed, persecuted, and criminalized. So all of these experiences led up to May 11th, 2019. And this was a crystallization of a diversity of voices because there was already greater awareness. You won't have a social outburst out of nowhere. Obviously, there is a process that leads up to it. And in a way, the outburst becomes a point of inflection of an earlier history. So by May 11th, when we went out to demand the state for the right to carry out the traditional march against homophobia and transphobia, there was already a critical collective behind it. And this also opened the way for later social outbursts. Marta was talking about independent journalism, but also independent activism. In my particular case, as an activist, I have had to understand also, since I am a black activist, I have had to understood the degree of racism in Cuban society and how it is also a source of discrimination within, for example, LGBT groups. Within the groups, there are also control devices and devices that discourage collective initiatives. So we should start from that when we try to understand May 11. It was a space for an agglutination of very diverse criteria and positions. And it was a moment where we could bring into view this social abundance. I think that there is also a repeated betrayal on the part of the Cuban state. There was a bill that was to be included in the constitution, and a group of civil society activists from different backgrounds and ideologies, but who were all interested in sexual and reproductive rights and the way, for example, the idea of equal marriage and the rights of the LGBTQ people. There was a conversation between these independent activists and the state when the constitution was being drafted, but actually it was all deleted and the article was removed from the project that was voted on. And later we were told that we can't even march. So I think that it's a double betrayal. You're told, hold on, we're going to write this Article 68. Okay, we removed it. I can't explain why. Although only a small percentage of the Cuban population, according to official numbers, only 1.5% disagreed with including the article on equal marriage in the Constitution. Something else that we should bear in mind is that there is a growing a growing influence of fundamentalist religious groups in Cuban society. As Leo was saying, before 2008, 2009, there wasn't so much internet access, and you weren't aware of how powerful these groups were. We should also understand this from the point of view of the sociology of religion. Pentecostal and other Protestant movements arrived later in Cuba because it is a closed and politically autarkic, and so waves of new Protestant movements that arrived in Brazil and Mexico uh, have reached Cuba, and so this is also a new clash. So in 2018, somewhat as you were saying, I was participating in a ballet, and I was amazed by the agreement. You had the new fundamentalist churches that were arriving in waves from Brazil, and at the time we were discussing the constitution, and you could see that there was an agreement, discursive agreement, and the fact that these churches were able to intervene against progressive policies. And this really surprised me because I, at least as an activist, I didn't know how important these fundamentalist groups were in Cuban society. Sure, there is a history that we should examine starting in the 1990s during the special period, but they had a very clear public presence. And after the 2018 referendum, since then they have gained further ground. And it has been a challenge for LGBTQ and anti-racist activists in Cuban society because it's yet another obstacle that we now have to confront in our attempts to position certain initiatives based on our interest, our knowledge, and our feelings. Ulises, I want to ask you a second question. What obstacles and resistances have you had to defeat in your defense of your rights? State controls, legislation, conservative society, and religious fundamentalism, which you have already discussed. Activists and independent journalists, we share something: criminalization. Our actions are interpreted as crimes, are disregarded. We are extremely unsafe. We feel like we are unprotected in our practice. And I should say, my activist friends and peers put so much work into our project. But Marta also talked about 2018 and civil society initiatives. As she said, since 2019, we see a critical awareness, and we have been able to present the state with our point of view in discussing legislation about the rights of our community. So there is, of course, the family code, which will be voted on next September. And we have been we have the discussions around the writing of this legislation. Many of the
como
people
todo,
who have been part of these
parte
discussions are
el Código de
independent
Familia pasado, ese ha
activists.
sido parte de la
Well,
agenda política del Estado
this
cubano. Ha entrado
legislation
y salido dentro del
has
cronograma
been
político. Pero yo creo que el
was
tema de la
in and
instrumentalización
out
no
of
está
the
no solamente
political
del gobierno
schedule,
cubano, sino también de los grupos
but I
opositivos
think that
que
there is a
sienten esto
problem,
como que
namely
hace parte y lo quieren
instrumentalization,
como
not just
lo,
by the
lo,
state or
lo
opposition
colocan dentro de
groups.
su agenda
Of course,
y
when they feel that they
la
need it, they bring it
circunstancia
into
cambia
their
quizás
agenda,
o son
but when
capaces de
circumstances
instrumentalizar prioridades
change,
y
they
eso es
leave
lo
it
que
out.
muchas de las personas LGBT
You
que hemos
know,
refrendado en este código, como por
according to
ejemplo
their
derechos con la
priorities.
persona
For example, the right to
del sexo
marriage,
género
of
y la posibilidad
same-sex
de
marriage,
atención especializada para las
the possibility
circunstancias a
of
parejas del
receiving
mismo sexo
um,
género,
care
la
in
posibilidad de
fertility care for same-sex couples,
del vientre subrogado, aunque tiene otra
the
categoría
possibility
en
of
nuestra normativa,
surrogate
son
parenting, although it's
elementos
labeled
que son
differently in
llamados
our
a la
laws.
urgencia por
These
parte del
issues
Estado cubano que los
are
ha
defended
incluido dentro del
at
cronograma
their
legislativo o
convenience
por parte de la
by the
oposición que lo
state
toma como
or the
estrategia en algunos
opposition.
momentos
They
o
bring
lo
it
saca de sus
up,
intereses
but then they
jurídicos, normativos, no sé cómo lo
leave it
quieran llamar,
out of their concerns depending on
cuando necesita
circumstances.
hacerle frente al Estado cubano. Entonces, yo creo que por ahí, yo creo que es un panorama muy
So I
complejo.
think that
Hay
this
que
is a
sumarle
complex
también la
outlook.
capacidad o la fuerza que tienen los sectores
There is this
fundamentalmente
opportunism,
religiosos
and
que
we
están por
also
ahí
have to
dentro de la sociedad
consider the
cubana, que
strength
claramente
of
son los religiosos
religious
que le dan más
fundamentalist
fuerza a esto.
sectors,
Por ejemplo, hay una iniciativa que se
but there are
contraprogramó
also
la iglesia
non-religious
cubana, la
conservative
iglesia de la comunidad
movements.
metropolitana, que
There is
radica en
something
Matanzas
called
y que
the
ha sido
Church of the
abiertamente
Metropolitan
a favor
Community
de
based in
personas LGBTQ,
Matanzas.
incluso con un ministerio
They are
que
openly
va
in
más allá de
favor
la
of
iglesia católica en realidad,
LGBTQ people,
pero son muy pocas las iglesias que son
but
capaces
there
de
are
abrirse
very few churches that
de
are
abrirse al
capable of
panorama
being
nacional
open
y ver la riqueza bueno, la riqueza que tiene de sus identidades, de su
to the
cuestión
diversity of
religiosa.
identities and
Y decía, sí, no solamente el fundamentalismo es parte,
so as I
incluso hay
said,
una especie de ambiente
there's a
de
kind of an
circunstancia
environment.
conservadora dentro de la sociedad cubana que hay que tener muy en
There's
cuenta
a
y que
conservative
complejiza
moment in
mucho, mucho
Cuban
lo planteado.
society, and this
Y
makes
aún
it
hoy,
very
a
much
pesar de
harder
que
for us. Even
aparentemente la opinión
today,
pública está a favor de aprobar el
although
referendo de quiebra la
apparently
frontera,
public
muchos de los
opinion
activistas
is likely
estamos
to
todavía
approve the referendum, many
sin
activists,
descanso porque
we
sabemos que
are still
puede
working
ser
tirelessly. We're not
peligroso
because we
pasar
know
por
that
ese
it might
proceso
not pass
y esperar,
on
pero
September
también la
25th.
experiencia te da que hay que tomar calma con todos estos
So, of course, we also have to
tomar
wait.
calma y ver
Experience
qué va a
teaches you
suceder.
to be patient
Pero
and see what
realmente la
happens.
sociedad que es hoy es mucho más compleja que la sociedad
But
que
the
pudo ser
truth
en el
is
2012
that
cuando yo
current
inicié
society
todo el
is
proceso,
much
es
more
decir, cuando
complex than it
comenzaba
was in
dentro del
2012 when I was
Authoritarianism,
taking my first
que la
steps
gente
as
no,
an
no éramos
activist.
activistas, éramos promotores de salud
Back then,
por los
we
derechos de
weren't
salud sexual y
activists,
reproductiva.
we were promoting health rights.
Hoy es mucho más compleja, es una sociedad mucho más
Today,
abierta, a pesar de las
the
limitaciones
society is much more
en
complex
muchas
and open,
cuestiones. Ya Leo hablaba
although
de
there
esto,
are many
pero es
limitations.
una sociedad que pugna por un espacio común
But
y que
it is
trata
a
de
society
ser
that
equitativa
is struggling for a common
partiendo de
space
esa
and that is
sociedad.
trying to be equitative, at least from the point of view of civil society.
Yo también, o sea, pienso que hay como antecedentes ahí. El Código de
I think
Familia ha
that
sido
there are also
enfocado,
some precedents. The family code,
o sea, un Código de Familia no se plebiscita, o sea, son derechos que no se
I mean,
plebiscitan, son derechos que se otorgan,
these are
tienen
rights
que
that you
estar,
shouldn't
debemos
be
aceptar ese
voting in
derecho.
by
Es un código
referendum.
viejo, es un
These are
código del año
rights that should be there.
75 el que tenemos,
It's an
que
old
incluye la
code. Right
posibilidad inclusive
now,
de
the
cambiar
code
el
is from
sentido. O sea,
1975,
entonces,
which
es
even
un código
includes
que
the
viene,
possibility for
que
minors
debiera
to
ser ya
marry.
reformado desde hace mucho tiempo.
So the code
Yo sí creo que
should
es un
have been
resultado del
reformed a
activismo
long time
y es
ago, and I
mucho
do
más
think that
allá
it is
de
a result of
los derechos
activism
de las
and it
personas
goes much further
LGBTIQ+, como
than
se ha
the rights
intentado
of
manipular
LGBTQ
de ambas
people.
partes, ¿no? O sea, para seguir
Both
hablando de que es un
parts have
código para minorías, cuando en realidad
created
es un
that
código para
picture and to
mayorías.
present it as a code for
Entonces,
minorities when it is
eso
actually a code for minorities. That's my opinion.
Bueno, en este momento vamos a pasar a hablar sobre el 11 de julio.
So now we are going to discuss July 11th.
Yo a mí mismo me lo digo, el 11 de julio nos cambió a todos.
I tell myself July 11th changed us all. It changed Cuba. We don't often see the depth of what happened.
Esta parte me toca compartirla a mí. Y yo me voy a hacer a mí mismo las preguntas como hacía un
I will talk now. I'm actually going to ask myself the questions inspired by a Cuban comic. First, I want to talk about the reality of families that we have been working with. Me and a diverse group of friends, I'm collaborating with a group of priests and nuns who have often set aside their religious duties, and there are people who offer all of their time, and other friends, communists, LGBTQ activists, what Pope Francis has called social friendship. Very diverse people thinking of the common good, and especially the good of families that are going through a very hard time. Because the people who went out to protest on July 11 no longer had anything to lose, but there were also people who still had some privileges but were also tired. So rather than talk about my experience, I would like them to speak here today. So we have brought videos. That's true. I should apologize because we announced Camila Rodríguez. It's a mistake. But as I was saying, there are two mothers who come from different social backgrounds. On the one hand, Marta Perdomo lives outside of Havana. She is a seamstress, a mother. She worked hard to get her children ahead. They could both go to university, Jorge and Nadir, and they are both political prisoners today. And then there is Elizabeth, a mother who lives in La Guinera on the outskirts of Havana, who's going through a very difficult economic social situation. The videos were produced by El Toque. They last around 20 minutes, and I will try to speak as little as possible because I think that it is they who should tell the story because they are resignifying activism in Cuba. They are the people from the neighborhood. They are the common Cuban who is saying, we cannot, it's enough. And they went out to protest. And today, in their bodies and stories and their environment, they are undergoing repression and harassment. So I think that it is they who should speak today. July 11 was unexpected. Banging the pans, everyone went outside to talk to the authorities. We were first of all demanding freedom and change in our country. Jorgito and Nadir are being regarded as leaders. When they were caught, they were just asking. They asked, who's paying you? Jorge and Nadir went out spontaneously. They are accused of something that they would have had to plan, but the boys didn't commit any crime. Nadir is accused of disobedience, public disorder, and Jorgito is accused of attack and public scandal. Since they left San Jose de las Lajas, they were already had their eye on them. When Jorgito addressed the authorities to explain their demands, one of them tries to hit him. He was ordered to do that because right away the kid was handed over the bicycle. Nadir was caught by a person from counterintelligence. He took off his mask and he said, "You don't know who I am? You'll get to know me." And on trial he said that they were friends, which is not true. On Saturday the police arrived. In this video we are going to explain what we think might happen. I have been getting threats. At some point you run out of fear. After 63 days, I heard their voice via phone for the first time, and only then we realized that they were taken to prison. They were put against the wall. They were told to strip, to squat. Then they were shackled in hands and feet. They were placed side by side, and they started beating Nadir until he fell to the ground. He is ill. He has health problems. And Jorgito, they made him suffer watching his brother be beaten. Then Jorgito was taken out and he was put in a cage, and he was simply told, "That's 30 years for you." There was no water, no light. He couldn't see at all. They were tortured, and no one is responsible. We found out by third parties that Nadir had COVID. It was very hard on him because there was one glass of water for 20 people. This all was said on trial. There were only using 5 videos. The lawyer could prove to the prosecutors that they were innocent. But the prosecution, in spite of the evidence that they had access to, they provided no evidence at all. Only 6 people. It was enough to see that they were state agents who testified, yeah, the guy with the beard, to incriminate them. Through due process, as regulated in our Constitution, they are presumed innocent, but in trial it must be proved that they committed those crimes they are accused of. When I saw these officials said that they needed to be solid evidence, and yet Jorge and Nadir were sentenced to 6 and 8 years in prison. Jorge is said to have been holding a flag, to have taken it from him and running away. Other witnesses said that gave contradictory testimony, so they said so many incoherent lies during the trial. Here the state owns everything, and clearly there cannot be justice. We cannot have an independent attorney. I do think that international organizations should do something for our country. My children are very well known in San Jose de las Lajas for their work Jorge studied computer science, and he taught. He helped young students, and Nadir did the same. When Nadir and Jorgito were imprisoned, Nadir's child was 6 months old. Jorgito's daughter is 6 years old. We have had to take them to counselors because our life has completely changed. We're a very close family. We would sit down for coffee together in the afternoon and talk about football. This house was always full of joy. And since July 11th, their children's lives changed, and so did our life. Many people have criticized me, maybe because I'm on social media since the first day that I realized my kids were in prison. But I think that as a mother, I cannot keep silent because I think that there is blood running through our veins, and if you pinch us, we have to jump. And in this case, all of our children are unjustly imprisoned. I tell all mothers that they should fight for their children's freedom because there is nothing sadder than being randomly placed behind bars. Although the videos show that they were trying to keep protesters from attacking police, they were sentenced to 6 and 8 years of prison. We will now hear Marta. And the fact that she lives under extremely different conditions shows that July 11 was a social outburst. Most people who have been imprisoned are poor and have no access to formal employment. When you look throughout the island, you will see a different reality. I am the mother of 5 children. 3 of them are in prison. One of them was released because he had nothing to do with the protests. The girl suffers from epilepsy after the trauma that we endured on July 12th on the yard of our house. On July 12th, I was working. I looked out and I saw the boys and children on the streets. I brought my grandchildren into the yard. My sister helped other young people come in, and the police grabbed her by the neck. And as I was trying to bring the children in, I told them, she has nothing to do with this. She's just bringing the children inside. They started beating me, and my older son looked from his house on the other side of the street, and he started screaming, "That's my mom, don't hit her." And since no one was paying attention to him, he threw a rock and they started shooting at him. And a camera captured when he fell on some electricity mesh. He was caught on the cables and they pulled him by one leg. When he fell, his leg broke on 3 spots and he has a rubber bullet in his abdomen. Before July 11, I was a working mother. My children worked, they helped me, they supported this household. Now, both my daughter and me, we can't sleep or eat. I had to leave it all behind because I have a tumor in my right side kidney and I have some blood issues and other health problems. The children have suffered greatly. We have had to lie to them, telling them that their parents are out working. We don't want to traumatize them. My 3 children who are in prison, the 2 youngest, they haven't been sentenced, but the prosecution requested 20 years. Jose hasn't gone to trial yet. It's still pending. For 8 months, the visitations are insane because they are being kept separate, and I requested them that they should be together. They said that they would look into it, but that they never did. And it's been 8 months. People from the government came to my house. There were 2 other people who were in civilian clothing. When they saw my real critical situation, they told me to pay no attention to anyone, not to denounce anyone, what I was going through. And right now I am denouncing, saying, and telling people what is happening because they have lied to me. They're not helping me at all. I have received no food or money from any government entity, and it's hard to say it, but I'm struggling. I'm selling what I can, and I'm trying to survive. I'm having a hard time to even just bring them a coat to wear, but even to provide food for their own children. When I was hit, nobody has paid for those blows. Nobody was brought to trial. For me, the solution would be that my 3 children were released. One of them has nothing to do. The other 2, their alleged crime was not against the government at all. They did not commit vandalism of any kind. At least if they could be sanctioned to do housework so that they can help me out. Those mothers who are still afraid to denounce on social media, which is our only option, maybe if they are listening to me, I would tell them not to be afraid. It couldn't get any worse than it already is, and somebody must listen. I think that you should not play with a mother's feelings. Elizabeth's youngest children were also sentenced to 8 and 10 years in prison. I feel that there is not much more to add after hearing these testimonies. My experience is that these are women who have been forced to reinvent themselves. They are both my friends. I'm very close to both. And something that always moves me is that when I come to their houses, they told me this is the only thing that I want. Because our children went out to ask for a better country on July 11 and 12, and now we are alone. It's very hard. Because in many cases they have had to learn how to use a cell phone. Many mothers are living in extreme poverty. They have a pig that they were keeping alive to maybe fix something in the house. They have had to sell it to buy a cell phone and learn how to use Facebook. When they do this, the police intimidate them. It's an extremely painful reality, and we have to learn to take a step back and let them be the voice of Cuba. And in line with these struggles by women and mothers, I want to discuss another issue of great concern in Cuba, namely feminicide and gender violence. So, Marta, I would like to ask you to tell us about the experience of Yo Sí Te Creo, I Do Believe You, an initiative by a group of feminist activists who have they've been doing two things. They've been working with women who are victims of violence, but they have also created a group of activists to confront a machista state. Yo Sí Te Creo is a platform. It started in 2019. At first, a Cuban singer known as La Diosa de Cuba denounced a Cuban musician called José Luis Cortés. She had been a performer in his orchestra and in a TV show, let's say a kind of like a tabloid kind of a TV show made by Cubans but not in Cuba. She denounced that she had been for years been the victim of violence perpetrated by that man. So a group of activists got together and they decided to create a group to support her throughout her search for justice and reparation from the very start. This became Yo Sí Te Creo, a platform that then provided similar support to other women who were victims of male violence. I think that it's not only a unique platform, it's also vital in Cuba because there is no other space where that kind of work is being done, even those state agencies that should do so by mandate. So, of course, as in other organizations, you cannot tell someone that they should do a public accusation against authorities, but we assist them when they do this. We provide psychological support and legal support. We are trying to work our way through Cuba's legal code where nothing is written down. The Cuban state often says that no crimes against women go unpunished, but there are feminicides that go unpunished. And we are saying crimes against women are to a great extent not crimes against women. They are feminicides, and we want them to be investigated and treated as such. In this path, Yo Sí Te Creo brought together a group of women, and we wrote a letter to the Cuba's parliament demanding specific legislation against male violence. We have been talking about this since 1995 after a visit from a special UN rapporteur who told us, why don't you require a law, an integral law? And she was right. Why don't we aim high? And in 2019, we did send this letter to Parliament demanding this legislation. It went much further, the letter, because we even provided specific solutions as to how to do it, and we also offered to assist them. So I would say this was one of the most important moments in the emergence of the feminist movement. It hadn't quite gelled yet, not only because we didn't want to, but also because the state does what it can to prevent it from happening. in 2003,
no, 1995,
I'm sorry,
existió una organización
1995,
de mujeres, eran todas
1997,
mujeres
there was
trabajadoras,
a
mujeres
women's
comprometidas
organization,
con el proceso
all
que
of
había llevado
them
la
who
revolución
worked
cubana.
in
Y estas
communication
mujeres,
and
algunas habían sido
who were committed to
luchadoras
the
de la
process of
lucha
the so-called Cuban
para
Revolution. Some of
al poder la
them
revolución. Y estas
had
mujeres
fought
se
with the
organizan y
revolution,
empezábamos
and
y
these
decían,
women
no
came
tenemos que
together
hablar
in a
de lo que nos
group
importa, tenemos que hablar
to
de
say
la
we need to
manera
talk
en que
about
queremos
matters
trabajar
to us and in the way in
para
which we
generar
want it to
algún
be
cambio
talked about,
con esto,
to
¿no?
create some
Y
change.
fueron llamadas, fueron
And they were
autorizadas y fueron obligadas a cesar
threatened
la organización. Bueno, la
and
organización
they
llegó a
were
tener 400
forced to
integrantes en
shut
toda Cuba,
down.
eso
The
en Cuba de los
organization
90
had
era mucha gente,
400
porque
members in
hoy lo
Cuba, and
es,
in the
pero
1990s it
en Cuba
was
de
a
los
lot.
90
It
era
still
como
is, but in the
una
1990s in
alarma y el
Cuba,
Estado decidió
that was an alarm, and the state
cesar el padre
decided,
maltratador
well,
y
it's an
arrancó
abusive father,
toda aquella experiencia. Y
so it shut it
desde
all
acá,
down.
bueno, había habido otra
And since
iniciativa de
then,
firmar una carta para apoyar
there was a
también
previous
relacionada con
initiative
Ulysses,
also
pero no
to
había redes sociales, o sea, eran
sign a
otras
letter, but
características.
we didn't have
Y
social media.
cuando llega
And
esta propuesta de Yo sí te creo, pues estábamos creo que un poco más listas para
when
enfrentarnos a la
Yo sí
maquinaria
te
del poder
creo came
de una
about, I think that we
organización
were a
que
bit more
trabaja
prepared to confront the
la
state's machinery.
clandestinidad,
It's a clandestine
quiénes son,
organization.
o sea,
We don't know who they are.
solo las mujeres que acceden a la
Only the
plataforma
women
como
who have
servicio
access
tienen
to the
contacto con
platform
algunas
as a
de
service have
sus
contact
integrantes,
with
pero tienen
some
que
of
estar en
its
clandestinidad
members,
porque hay grandes riesgos
but they need to do
para
it
sus vidas, el
anonymously
riesgo del
because
Estado
they run
machista,
great risk.
totalitario y represor,
There
pero
is,
también
on the
está el
one hand, the
riesgo
state,
de los
but
compañeros, los
there are
experiments
also
violentos de estas mujeres.
the
Y
violent
también, creo que lo decía antes,
partners
el
of
Estado puede
these women
usar
victims.
esto de alguna manera, ¿no?
And the state could also
Perdemos
find a way
nuestra
to use
información,
it
nuestra
against
seguridad
them.
y resultamos atacadas por otras personas que no es el Estado, ¿no?
They might
Entonces,
sell our
ese
information and
es
we
lo que
might be
intentamos en la
attacked by
plataforma.
someone outside the state. I am
Sí
not
hemos
part of the platform
batallado por la
myself.
plataforma. Yo también he sido una
They
mujer
have supported
sobreviviente de
me.
violencia
I
machista
am also a
y
survivor
feministas
of male
sobrevivientes de las
violence.
violencias machistas. Y hemos podido
Feminists
sufrir
are
mucho.
also sometimes
Y
survivors of
también
male violence.
la
That tells you
apoyo con
something.
todas mis fuerzas y
And
replico
I
absolutamente
also
todo.
support them
Es una plataforma también que hemos
completely.
apoyado desde INSTAR, desde
And
siempre.
also INSTAR
Los
supports
feminicidios
them.
es un tema,
Feminicide is
digamos, un debate incipiente todavía en Cuba,
the
pero está
discussion
muy
around
claramente definido.
feminicide
El
is
Estado
just
ha
beginning in
demorado
Cuba,
alrededor
but
de
it is clearly
19 años
defined.
por las
The
presiones
state
que hicieron
has
durante
delayed
décadas desde
until
ese paraíso
2019
en reconocer la existencia del
after the
feminicidio
pressure that we
con base
exerted
en
with
las mismas
our
cifras.
letter. Only
O sea,
now they
si
acknowledge
se registra,
feminicide
obviamente,
using numbers from
pero
2016.
solo
Of
hasta
course,
2016.
feminicide is under recorded.
Luego ha dicho en otros espacios
And later, the
que
state
en
has
Cuba no
said in
ocurren
other
feminicidios,
spaces
sino
that there are no
femicidios. La
feminicides in
diferencia es
Cuba. They
muy
say that there are
simple y muy evidente.
femicides. The
Además,
difference is very
en términos de
simple
comunicación
and very
social,
cynical.
el Estado se quita responsabilidades, porque el
The
feminicidio
state does not
estaría, o sea,
assume responsibility.
queremos tipificar, hay una
We
responsabilidad
want
estatal, pero no
feminicides
hay
to be typified,
para que las
and
mujeres puedan
the state
denunciar
is
ese feminicidio.
responsible for the absence of
Y el
structures that
feminicidio
allow women
no
to
incluye esa
denounce.
responsabilidad estatal.
But femicide, as
Es
they
una
describe it
plataforma que también
legally,
incluye la responsabilidad estatal.
leaves
Y en
the
el caso
state free
cubano,
of such
también es un Estado
responsibility.
cubano, un Estado feminicida. O sea,
So, in the
otros
case of
tantos
Cuba,
estados,
the state is
no
also
puedo
a
ser
feminicidal
totalmente absoluta, no
state.
conozco
The
todos los
Cuban
países en
state,
el
as
mundo,
many
pero
other
de alguna manera
states.
todos los estados
I wouldn't say
tienen una
all
mujer en
countries in the
situación de
region,
violencia,
but
o
I
sea,
do think that
de
all of the
femicidio,
states that
quiero decir,
leave
no
women
de violencia
unprotected
machista.
from male violence are feminicidal states.
Ay, yo quería, perdón, y tenemos lo que hemos
Sorry.
logrado hacer, o sea, tenemos dos
What we
observatorios de
have
feminicidio, uno de la
achieved,
revista
we have
Documenta,
two
otro de
observatories on
una de las
feminicide.
editoriales
One of them is
independientes
run
con
by
distintas.
one of the
Y yo sí te creo, esta plataforma también
one of the independent publication projects, and Yo Sí Te Creo. They also have an observatory. At the time, there are 36 confirmed feminicides in Cuba this year. Right before we left, uh, we established that one of the girls who was missing, her body was found, but I don't have confirmation of this being a feminicide. We need to validate, and we do mean to do this not just for the women, but also because we want to be able to confront the Cuban state, which is looking for any possible way to discredit us. So we really validated exhaustively to determine. So there are these two observatories, and of course, we cannot record all cases. We go by what civil society reports. There are localities where each and every person has been threatened to prevent them from giving information about feminicide. This was done through the 370 decree, which is intended to silence freedom of expression. And we are campaigning against it. And it has been used against these communities to prevent them from denouncing or reporting feminicides and infanticides. Well, I want to thank Marta and Ulises. We are now going to have an open conversation. I think Tania wanted to ask a question, and if anyone else wants to as well. I wanted to ask a question. There is a myth, a great myth around the revolution, namely that Afro-descendant or black populations have been treated as equals. But during the last year, the police have murdered 3 young black men. I wanted to ask if one of you could explain how do you think, to what degree do you think there is equality, or are there racial inequalities in Cuba? Before I hand the mic to Ulises, who I think knows more about it, I always ask myself a question. Why am I free? And I went out to protest on July 11, and the kids from La Winera, who are in the most part mixed race, are not university students. I studied the sentences. None of the 4 young people who were charged and brought to trial did not go to university. Why am I free and why are they in prison? Why is it that in El Vedado, la police will not kill a young person, but it does happen in El Condado, in Santa Clara? These are questions I ask myself. I often know the answer, but I do ask these questions. I think it's an interesting question. Mbembe says that in modernity, the delirium of modernity is actually race. At some point, race always turns up again and again. And in the case of Afro-descendant people, after July 11, this has been one of the part of the population that was more strongly impacted, because there's not only race, there are other variables such as social inequality, poverty, lack of access to the internet, lack of access to travel, leaving the country, and getting a higher education. So race encompasses many other variables of discrimination and inequality, which places these sectors into a great disadvantage. Also, in terms of social mobility, black people have less opportunities to have access to spaces of greater privilege. We are without a doubt talking about a group who are just out of luck, as the president said recently. Well, it's part of my personal history. The fact that Jorge Enrique could not attend this event and the ordeal that I had to go through to come also shows how the white people in power often speak the same language, the language of discrimination, and they also use a strategy, so they also deny an older white man the visa. I think that patriarchal patriarchal power, as I call it, is out in the open, but it's not as visible as we want it to be, so that it is clear that these are all lies and myths. The thing is that this is nothing new. What happened in July 11 is that the crisis became deeper, but these are processes that come from the time of the colony, and there is a historical continuity. One of the first texts of Cuba's modernity is the text against vagrancy, and it described a set of negative characteristics, which most of which was attributed to the black population. Then you have the first writings of Fernando Ortiz, although Ortiz changed his understanding of culture later on, and he came to include the black person as a power in Cuban culture, but his first writings are attempt a collective psychology of the black population in Cuba. And one way or another, this slowly builds up a way of thinking that places black populations at a disadvantage. The revolution generated access to education, health, and work for black people. Clearly, during times of crisis in the 1990s and later, and even today, during the pandemic, we have seen how the populations that were hit the hardest were black populations because they don't have access to emergent sectors. They are placed in subaltern positions in Cuban society because often they have to rely on informal economies to survive. So there is an arrange of circumstances that leads these populations to crime. It's not just about legislation. I can say in my house everyone has to wear purple, but then that can change. In Cuba, it has been said Afro-descendant black people are equals. Women are equal, but it is not enacted. You don't do this simply by legislating. You need public policy. You have to change the ecosystem. Otherwise, it doesn't work. If you tell a poor black woman that she lives in a small house that she shares with many others in precarious conditions, and you tell her that she's an equal, what is she supposed to do? I think that all of this reflects this sheds light on something that we knew in Cuba. Schools. The school to which I went, you had to take a test to go in, and it was supposed to only the smartest people were supposed to be able to get in, although we know that tests don't guarantee that. But this was the population in that school was majority white, the children of high level officials. And this was in the 1990s. So already for me, and I denounced this when I was in the school, this means something because other people would not have access to university studies in equality of conditions to me. I think the La Winera neighborhood says a lot because most of the population is mixed race, but in the official discourse after July 11th, they have this whole thing where they are like they pretend to go to the neighborhoods, they paint over a couple of walls, and they don't do much more. They tried it to normalize the situation of people who didn't have access to the supplies notebook, but it wasn't real. And the social fracture remains as long as the young people are in prison. Most of them during trial are described as jobless, as having a criminal record. Well, if you go there, they are not jobless. They depend on the fluctuations of the economic market in a country that remains under constant inflation. Maybe they did some construction work in some ruins and selling them to sustain their children because access to certain jobs is unavailable to them because they come from a poor neighborhood.
Em, em, ¿Ustedes cómo ven, perciben a nivel Latinoamérica que
How
los
do
últimos 2
you
años han habido
what do you
no
think
solo
of
acá,
Latin America?
no solo en Cuba, sino en Colombia,
During
en
the
Chile?
past couple of years,
¿Cómo
also
ven
in Colombia
la
and in
evolución de estos
Chile,
estallidos
there
sociales
have been these social
qué tan
outbursts or
positivos son ustedes con
estallidos.
respecto al futuro en
Do
Cuba
you
y en general
what do
en
you make of
Latinoamérica?
that, and do you have a positive appraisal of what is happening in Cuba and elsewhere? Something has happened with these social outbursts since 2019. In Chile, we have seen a wave of protest movements in Latin America, and Cuba is part of that. Even before in 2018, there were other such protests in Nicaragua and Venezuela. When they happen in countries with right-wing governments, they are applauded. They talk about civil disobedience, and the Cuban news celebrate them. When I debate somebody who is in favor of the regime, I say, oh, that's great. Citizens went out to the streets in Colombia and Chile, but in Cuba they are vandals, they are criminals. Civil disobedience is also very closely linked to poverty in Cuba because the 4 or 5 stores that were vandalized, and I completely disagree with that, but those stores represent an oppressive power to those young people who have no euros or dollars or family abroad who could send them money. So there is an economic apartheid in Cuba, and so I think that there was civil disobedience, and I think that any reclamation from the citizens is legitimate, but we have academics in Cuba who applaud what happened in Ecuador. And I'm sorry to say this, but fuck, brother, when it happened in Cuba, you yourself criminalized the protesters. And you have this in among people in power, but also some intellectuals who are two-faced, and it deeply saddens me because these are people who many of us work with as researchers. Some time ago, a group of us signed a document, a manifesto against silence. We were responding to the prison terms of up to 25 years for protesting, to citizens from poor neighborhoods, the people who we work with as scholars, and many intellectuals, whether because they want to hold on to their privilege or because they are afraid, because it is hard to overcome fear. It hurts and it's an internal struggle, but also often many colleagues, intellectuals, do not come out and say this is an injustice. I always ask myself, how can you explain to the mother of a political prisoner the term sedition? In Cuba, many young people have heard this word only twice in their lives, during class when they were in school, we were being taught the history of Cuba. And maybe they didn't hear them because on that day the teacher did go to class because they had to be standing in a line. So some of them heard the word sedition for the first time during the trial, and many mothers would ask me, what is that word? How do I explain? All I could say was, look, it's as if they were trying to create a state inside the state. It was my only tool to explain to them, to people who have not received an education. They went to trial and they couldn't understand what their children were on trial for. So there is a deep human issue here. I am unable to give people formulas. In Cuba, I have spent all my life hearing two poles that both of which say what needs to be done in Cuba. I am for non-violence, but I do stand behind the right to anger. I mean, come on, it's hard. You have to be really fucked to see how long you can endure. So I see that, for instance, feminist movements and the fact that they have been criminalized during the protest, I understand their anger and I am angry. I have a way of channeling my anger, but not everyone does it in the same way. We have all been taught to be violent in our societies. So beyond the fact that I promote nonviolence and other forms of action in public space, I can understand it. There is a young trans woman, one of the few who are recorded in the list of prisoners from 11J, Brenda Diaz. She is accused of throwing rocks against one of these stores where no Cubans can buy. And I remember that when I read what she was accused of, what do you mean throwing a rock against a shop window? She has been thrown rocks at all her life. Trans people in Cuba, people have thrown rocks and even acid at them all their lives. The state needs to ask for her forgiveness, and they need to give her reparations. She must be released. They have been thrown rocks at all their lives. What I would recommend to Latin America beyond political sides is not to be polarized any further, and do not renounce your civil society institutions. If you turn over to the state, as our parents and grandparents did, the possibility of controlling everything, you will lose all your liberties, because this is what states do. This is what power does. controlling freedom. Maybe one day there will be a non-patriarchal power. We will see. Hopefully, we deserve it. I don't feel optimistic, but I know we deserve it.
Además, Marta, hay un detalle. Nosotros
Also,
desde niños
Marta,
tenemos el discurso
since
violento
we were
hacia
children,
muerte,
we have this violent discourse, patria o muerte,
puntas de la estrella, o sea, todo es como lo
the tips of
punzoña,
the stars.
violento.
It's all about
Entonces tú dices, y el día que la ciudadanía, fíjense, o sea,
violence and weaponry.
cuando
If
tú
one
comparas
day,
la
citizens,
intensidad del
if you
estallido
compare the
con
intensity
los
of the
niveles de violencia
outburst
es mínimo.
with the episodes
Te
of
estoy hablando
actual
de una ciudadanía
violence,
que es sumamente
it's
pacífica.
there are
60
very
ciudades,
few.
5 tiendas.
Cuba is
Las cosas
extremely
están hechas
peaceful. In 60 cities,
no
5
pasa
stores, and you bear in mind what
caramelo
those stores, what is
carne.
their significance.
Es que es una
Children
cosa
walk by and
humana.
they see a piece of candy
Pasa,
that they
ves el
could not
caramelo, no es ni
afford.
el caramelo, la leche en
It's not even a
polvo
piece of
para
candy, I
tomar
mean
sus hijos por
powdered
la mañana. O
milk.
sea, mira, vaya, a Dios gracias que fueron 5 tiendas.
Thank God
Otra cosa
it
sucede
was
con Brenda,
5
Brenda
stores.
la acusaba
Something
de
else about Brenda, she
cambiar
was
su
accused
identidad. Brenda es
of,
una muchacha
she's a
trans, y
trans
la acusaban de
woman,
haber salido
and
vestida de
she was
mujer, de ser mujer.
accused of going out in
Eso lo
disguise as a
desconoce
woman that day.
dentro de
We were, that
dentro
was
del expediente,
actually
dentro de la pericial.
removed from
Pero
her,
a ella la
from the
acusaban de
charges,
mentir
but
porque
she
estaba
was being
vestida de
accused
ser
of
mujer.
lying about her identity because she was wearing a dress.
Otra cosa en relación con la pregunta que hiciste inicialmente, a
And
mí lo que
something else in connection to your
yo
question,
no sé por qué yo desde 18 a 19
I
años
don't
yo seguía todas
know
las protestas que pasaban, que
why.
fueron en Chile, también en Barcelona, también.
Since
Es decir,
18 and 18,
casi
I have
todos los
followed all of the
hubo
protests, not
protestas,
just in Chile, but Barcelona and Hong
también hubo
Kong.
protestas, hubo estallidos sociales. Y a mí lo que bueno, nosotros siempre los cubanos llegamos tarde, pero
Well,
lo que
in
me llamó
Cuba,
la
we're
atención es
always
que
late,
había
but
siempre en
what
Cuba, hay como
struck
cierto
me was
desfasaje
that
entre la realidad mundial y lo que
in
sucede en
Cuba,
Cuba.
it's
Y
always out of
el
phase with
estallido
world
social yo creo que vino
reality.
a nivelar
So our
ese desencuentro
outburst,
nuestro
to
con
some
el
extent, was
mundo
us
y el
catching
nuestro,
up with the
así como
world.
entender que tampoco nuestras dinámicas, a partir,
And this
aunque
allowed
pertenezcamos a
us
un
to
Estado socialista,
understand
no
that
sabíamos
although
mucho
we
de
have a
de
socialist
las
state,
dinámicas
it's not
globales de
too
alguna manera.
different from what is happening elsewhere in the world.
Tenías una pregunta.
Tanya, you had a question?
Bueno, hay algo que yo no, que me gustaría preguntar porque lo preguntó alguien
There's
online y me
something
gustaría
I would
pasarle
like
la
to
pregunta un
ask
poco.
because somebody made the question online and I
Voy
would like to pass it
a
along.
modular la pregunta, es decir, ¿qué está sucediendo en Cuba que a
What is
veces
happening
los
in Cuba?
activistas están como
Why is it
divididos?
that
Hay un
activists are
activista
sometimes
que quiere las
divided?
libertades,
There are
digamos,
those
de
who
los derechos
want
humanos de primera generación.
are fighting for first
La
generation human
transparencia,
rights,
libertad de
let's
asociación,
say
libertad
freedom of the
política,
press,
etcétera,
freedom of
y
association,
activistas que están
political
pidiendo libertades, digamos, de primera
freedoms,
generación, que es
and
como las cosas
activists who are calling
de
for, let's say,
identidad, de
fourth
género,
generation
libertad,
rights having to do with identity,
de
gender, race,
medioambientales, etcétera.
environmental
En este
rights,
momento está
etc.
sucediendo algo que está
Right
trayendo
now,
esto a su máxima expresión, que es el Código
this is
Familia, que se está
something
llevando a votación,
is going
y es
on
como una
that,
especie de
namely the discussions
confrontación,
around the family
digamos, de
code,
discusión
have
entre los
led to a kind
activistas,
of
porque
confrontation
hay
or this
unos
debate
que
between
están
among
pensando
activists
que
because
se
some of
deben
them
pedir todos los
think
derechos,
that
otros piensan
we
que
need
se,
to call for
se puede
all
empezar por
rights,
algunos
while
derechos.
others
Entonces,
think that we
esto
can start
parece ser
by calling
uno
for
de
a
los
few
temas
rights
más
and wait for others.
difíciles
And this
del
seems to
activismo en
be
Cuba,
a source of difficulty for activism in
donde hay un
Cuba.
desencuentro entre activistas que pueden
There
salir
is
bien por las
a bit
calles
of a
y las personas
disagreement among
observan que lo que
activists
están
who
de
might
acuerdo con
first
estas,
go out together to the streets, but then
digamos,
they split because
discusiones
they
o
cannot
oleadas
agree
políticas,
on
¿no? ¿Qué
these
piensan ustedes, ya
priorities.
que
What do you think?
por la experiencia que tienen?
Ayer creo que estábamos hablando de esto.
I
Yo
think we
lo
were
he dicho
talking
más
about
claro.
this
Yo creo que
yesterday.
esto,
I have
lo que
said
nos
this
está
clearly.
pasando con
I
el
think that
código de
what
las
is
familias
happening now
es parte
around
del
the
camino que
family
está ocurriendo.
code is
O
part of
sea,
a
yo creo que el
script
Estado
that the Cuban state is following.
cubano
I
lo ha
think
hecho
that the
bien.
Cuban state
Lo ha hecho
is
bien. O sea,
doing
en
is
vez de
doing
poner
things
en todas las
well.
elecciones, en todos
I
los
mean,
debates, o
we're
sea,
going through all of
hijos de las
these
familias,
debates,
derechos que no se plebiscitan, serán
and as I said, these
plebiscitados
rights that
y
being
absolutamente
put out to
en meses
referendum,
de
they
debate.
should not be
Mientras
voted.
nos pasaban
After
y nos
months of
dejaban uno
debate,
de los códigos
then
penal
again,
medieval.
we
Los activistas y
they
las
passed a
activistas,
medieval penal code.
los que se dedican a la política, o sea que ya no son
The
entendidos
people who are
exactamente como
activists, the
activistas, porque tienen
people
partidos
who
políticos y otro tipo de
are not
intenciones
activists
con
but who have
el
political
poder,
parties and do other kinds of political work,
nos hemos comido
we
el cuento. O sea,
we swallowed
nos
the
comimos el
bait.
cable. Estamos peleando, y es
We're
exactamente lo que quiere el
fighting.
Estado cubano que
It's
hagamos.
exactly what the
Porque
Cuban
mientras
state
eso pasa,
wants.
y ahorita no lo
Because while we are
hacemos,
fighting
porque fue un olvido, hay una
for
ley
the
de
family
medios
code,
de
in
comunicación.
the meantime,
O
they
sea,
passed a law
y
that
el problema es que
controls
ya nos aprobamos,
media
pero está la ley
and
de medios
the
que se
penal
podría
code, which has
consultar
already
y
been
que
approved.
también es un
The media
gran,
law
serio,
might
absolutamente serio
also
problema
be
para
summoned to
desarrollar la nación.
referendum, and it will
Otro guindaste,
incredibly
otra
hinder the
preocupación.
development of
Y
the
nosotros
nation. So
estamos
it will be
discutiendo
yet
algo
another
que en
gag.
definitiva es un derecho de las personas. Usted
And what
como
we are discussing
el que
now should
vota,
not be
solo
discussed.
es
It's a
importante
right of
primero
people.
saber que si usted vota no al Código de la Familia, se queda el Código de 1975, en el que
You can
no solo
vote for
no
the
hay una
family
afirmación de
code,
igualdad
yes or
ni
no.
abolición
If
de
you
las
vote
personas
no, then we have the
y demás,
1975
sino
code
bueno, seguirá
where
siendo
same-sex
igualitario.
marriage is
Pero si se queda el del
not
75,
an
que es el
option,
matrimonio
and then
infantil,
we still have
la patria potestad, o sea, es un concepto
marriage
viejo,
among
eso es lo que pide.
minors.
La patria potestad además es un concepto también impulsado por el
The
feminismo.
concept of
Entonces,
patria potestad is an old
para
concept that has
los
also
feministas
been
hemos
promoted
evolucionado
by
todas y todos,
feminism.
entonces ya
So
uno se
sure,
habla de
we have all
corresponsabilidad y
evolved,
tiene un poco
and now
más
we
de
are talking
sentido,
about
más código.
co-responsibility, and it makes a bit more
Yo,
sense and it's
la verdad que no
more
estamos
just.
entendiendo
But the
muy
truth
bien
is
esta
that
discusión.
maybe
Sabemos que los derechos humanos
I don't
no llegan
understand the
ni ahora
discussion
ni
very
ahorita.
well. We know that
Se
human
llamen de
rights have
primera o de
no
cuarta generación.
priorities,
O
whatever the
sea, se
generation
pueden
they
llevar
are
todas esas
supposed
luchas
to
juntas. Creo que hemos
come from.
equilibrado
We can fight
este código. O sea, aquí no
all of these
estamos
fights
votando
together. I think that in the
por
case
el
of this
gobierno
code,
cubano.
we have
Estamos
made a
votando para
mistake
que
because we
una
are
gran
not
mayoría,
voting for the
una
Cuban
minoría
government. We
más
are
las
voting for a
pobres,
great
las pobres
majority
madres
of people,
solas,
not a
porque los
minority.
hijos se van y no
Poor
va un
mothers
medio. O sea, un medio, en el mejor de los casos, es una cifra
who are on their
ridícula
own
para el
because
gobierno
the
cubano, que
men
tiene
leave and they
derechos
pay
además sobre
nothing
los
at
niños que
all.
después les impiden
And they
sacarlos del
retain
país. O
rights
sea,
over the
una serie de
children and
luchas y que
prevent
además
mothers from bringing them out of the
cuando
country.
están viejos y no sé cuánto,
And
queriendo
then when they're
establecer una
old,
relación, todo eso se
they want
resolvería.
to
Serían
establish a
paternidades más
relationship.
felices, maternidades más
This
felices,
this will
más
all be
poderes
worked out.
reconocidos por la gente. Entonces, yo creo que sin animarlos a nada, no estoy haciendo ningún
So
tipo de,
I
no estoy
think
haciendo
I'm
ningún
not
tipo de campaña,
trying
solo digo, yo voy a
to
votar
campaign.
cristiano
I
cuando
am saying
cuando estoy aquí y no dejan votar a nadie de
I
afuera.
might actually not be able to
Pero
vote because I'm
yo votaría
abroad and I
sí,
cannot
o sea,
vote
yo
from
sí
abroad, but I would vote
eh,
yes. My vote is
por
yes.
este motivo. Yo creo que Cuba necesita
For this
actualizarse
reason,
y
I
paralelo a
think that
eso, le digo al Estado
Cuba
cubano lo que le he dicho
needs
siempre, se están
to
lavando la cara, lo
get
sé,
updated.
no sé
I
cómo
know
van a
that
hacer para que este código sea un
the
código
state
efectivo, o sea, cómo
is
van a
using
utilizar
this
esta,
to improve its image.
o sea, cómo
I
van a
don't know
usar las
how they are
iniciativas para
going
traducir un código que
to
parece de
create
Noruega en la
administrative
práctica,
laws to
que es una
enact
orfandad
a
medieval,
code that seems as if
pero
it were had
pues
been
parece
written
que con la
in
cara lavada se
Norway,
ven mejor las muecas.
but I
Entonces,
think that it's still better.
Yo creo que aquí hay varias. Tania nos presenta una pregunta
I
muy
think
amplia.
that Tanya's
Primero,
question
hay un
is very
escenario de
broad.
complejización para bien
First,
de la sociedad civil
there
cubana.
is a positive, greater
Tenemos
complexity
una
in
sociedad civil
Cuban
que se
society.
expande.
I mean,
Yo creo que eso es
our
muy
civil
positivo.
society is
Y
expanding, and
yo
I
creo que
think that
cada
this
entrega
is
generosa,
positive.
o sea,
And
cada
I think
entrega
that
es un paso a la democracia y a la transición. La
each
lucha
entry is a
animalista
step towards
es un
democracy. For
paso
example, the
más
fight for the rights of animals
articulador
is
para
one
derechos
more
en
step to acquire further rights and the care of our common household, civic thought, and the occupation of public space. The struggle of the LGBTQ plus struggle, the feminist struggle, have also led to the acknowledgement of decades worth of struggle, during which a state that 50 years a state that 50 years ago would just as easily send an artist, a priest, or a gay man to a labor camp. And this has taken a lot of effort and suffering. I don't think that this code is an achievement of the Cuban state. It's an achievement of concrete people with concrete life stories who have been able to get this legislation across. In spite of the many problems, I know, for example, very smart people who are going to abstain, but I think that they are beginning to understand in their inner forum civic exercise of civics, because to abstain is a civic action. I think that this is creating a space of political discussion that did not exist in Cuba, because there are people who are giving their all, and others of us who have supported them, but it's also allowing us to see how complex a society it is. Although totalitarianism aims to keep it at a level, democracy continues to spring. What we are seeing, for example, within the Catholic Church, which is it's defying the Vatican's position, which hopes to be one of mediation, is pushing forward. And we are seeing this in different sectors of society, and this proves that we are, as a civil society, we are becoming stronger slowly, and maybe it's better for it to be slow. So the challenge is to articulate. It's articulation. Annamelis Ram used to say, in Cuba, power is not afraid of unity. The word unity spooks me when they say let's unite. No. But if we say let's articulate, Marta will continue to be a feminist, but I will support her. But when she talks about euthanasia, on that day, I will be on the opposite side. So where can we reach consensus? What democratic values can we discuss? It's about understanding the Cuban state and its mechanisms of control. I'm not saying this to get anyone to vote yes or no. I am not campaigning for the code. I think that people have already made up their minds. I am saying this so that we may understand. They could have passed the whole code by decree and we wouldn't have been able to say anything about it, as they did with the penal code. So all of a sudden, they come up with a referendum on this particular issue. It makes me suspicious, because what I would like to happen is not for people to vote yes or no. That's my responsibility. I will vote as I please, and no one can tell me how to vote. But I do think that we should be suspicious. We need to trust each other, but we need to be suspicious of what the state does. I mean, let's question everything they do, because it's also a state that has been in place for 60 plus years, which feel like millennia. They've not done this by using weapons. They have applied other mechanisms. that have also been applied elsewhere in the history of humanity. So we need to think about this. What really bothers me the most in this whole situation, I have to deal with very conservative people on a day-to-day basis, and I love them a lot, but I tell them it's simple. We are talking about human lives. It's a person's happiness. When you vote, and I am campaigning because I have supported the code from the start. When you vote yes, think, I'm sorry, it's the Catholic in me speaking now. When you vote yes, it's about someone else's happiness, and you have no right to impede that. You need to contribute to another's happiness because they have gone through all of the hardships to be able even to inherit, to share, to have the right that you enjoy. And last night I was saying this, and I say it now to all Christians. I don't care about crucifixions. As San Ireneo used to say, the happiness of man and woman. So it's as simple as that. Nobody has the right to make another person's lives miserable. We have a social right to contribute to the fullness of others' lives.
¿me escuchan? Yo
I
creo que lo
think
que enuncia este contexto es
that,
realmente, como decía Leo, es la complejidad y
as Leo says,
digamos, la
the present
diversidad de cosas
context
que puede
shows
atribuir
us
uno a
that
cualquier
there
fenómeno,
is
como realmente
a
esto de
diversity
pasó,
of
sucedió antes
opinions in Cuba.
con el
It's
referendo
not just in the case
del
of the
referendo
family
constitucional,
code, before
específicamente
when
con el
there
artículo
was the
67, porque ya
constitutional
hablamos de
referendum and
personas,
specifically
hablar
Article
de personas,
68.
y ha venido sucediendo, es decir, la posibilidad de que
Um,
muchos
this
actores
has
sociales
happened.
tengan
It's
voz
possible now for
en el
many
espacio
social
público,
actors
en el
to have a
espacio
say
virtual
in public
y,
space and in virtual
que
spaces,
posicionen sus
and
criterios
they
en las
can
mesas de
present
discusión.
their
Hay que
opinions there.
realmente aprender de esto
We
como
have to
y
learn from
aprender
this.
que hoy pueden ser aliados, pero mañana puede estar
That today some of
en una
them may be
contrapose.
our
Y
allies
aprender
and
sobre todo también
tomorrow they may
cuáles van a
be
ser las
our
nuestras
opponents.
armas
We have to
para
learn
poder
what our weapons will
seguir
be
posicionando un
so
debate
that we
en
can
torno a
continue
derechos
to
y a la ampliación de esos derechos.
develop a debate around acquiring some rights and expanding those
¿Alguna otra
rights.
pregunta? Bueno,
Are there
agradecerle
any
a
other
Ulises, a
questions?
Marta por estar
Okay, I want to
hoy aquí
thank
y a
Ulises
todos
and
los que nos han
Marta
acompañado a lo largo del
for
panel,
being here
agradecer sus
today,
preguntas
and everyone in the audience. I want to
y
thank you for your
agradecer Instar, que es la
questions,
casa de
and
todos,
I want to thank
y el
INSTAR,
equipo que yo
which
no lo
is
uso,
the house
pero
for
como yo
us
siempre digo,
all.
Instar es un espacio para ver el barrio.
As I always
Es un
say,
espacio de
INSTAR is a
conocer y
space for
invitarlos al
seeing
desvelo
the
también.
neighborhood.
Siempre hay que promocionar el desvelo.
And I
El
also
lunes
want you
vamos a
to
tener un
invite
desvelo
you
en Kassel
to
a
join
las
us at
3.
El
Vamos a hablar sobre
Desvelo. On
censura,
Monday, we will have one of our
democracia
Desvelo
y cómo se
meetings
dice
in
por ahí.
Kassel. We will talk about
Vamos a tener
censorship.
invitados de lujo.
We
Y
will
lo hacemos
have
siempre por
incredible
Telegram porque es la
guests.
aplicación que la gente
And we
consume menos
always do
datos en
this
Cuba.
via Telegram
Y
because it's the
eso nos
app
gusta más,
that consumes less data in
menos
Cuba
difícil de
and
tumbar.
works the
Y con
best.
nosotros, Marta, que Marta y yo somos clientes amorosos de Texas.
Marta and
Así
I
que,
are
bueno,
loving
muchas gracias
customers.
y que tengan linda tarde.
Thank you very much and have a nice afternoon.